welcome to Sew with Stacy. I want to talk a little bit about scrap fabric. As you start sewing more and more projects together, you'll end up with more and more piles of scrap fabric. Now, a lot of the times people might just throw this away, which is a real shame because this is still really good fabric and you can still use it for lots of things. Today, I want to show you two techniques that I use on a very regular basis that can take this scrap fabric and turn it into bigger pieces of fabric for which you can then make whatever you want from it, as long as you have enough of it. What we're going to make today? I'm not quite sure just yet, but let's go gather all of my scrap fabric that I've got and get sewing. For both of the techniques I'm going to demonstrate today, you're going to need scrap fabric. You'll want a nice selection of different scraps. Whatever scraps you have, gather them together and figure out what you want to make from those scraps. You'll also need some thread. I'll decide what color thread I'm going to use once I choose the colors and patterns I want to make with my scraps. Along with the scrap fabric, for the second technique we're going to show you, you're going to need a piece of interfacing. Now there is lots of types of interfacing and stabilizers out there, and I'll have a separate video that will talk about interfacing for you to watch if you don't know much about it. However, for today's project, you'll need a small piece of interfacing that is fusible and iron-on. Now what that means is fusible means it allows things to stick on it. There's a little bit of a layer of glue so we can stick fabric on top of it. And the iron-on allows you to iron it and it will activate that glue so the fabric will stick on it. You also want interfacing that's lightweight for this particular project. You will also need a few items from your sewing toolkit. Let's grab your fabric scissors, your fabric pencil or chalk, and your ruler, because as you're putting whatever design you're putting together with your scraps, you might want to cut them. You might need to measure how big or how small the piece that you're making is. You'll also want to grab your pins, and finally, I always grab my seam ripper because you never know what mistakes might happen. The first technique I want to show you today is called patchworking. The concept behind patchworking is taking pieces of fabric, sewing them together to create bigger patterns or designs that you can use for practically anything you want to make. If it's a blanket, if it's a pillow, or more recently I've been seeing a lot of jackets, skirts, dresses, and even tops made from patchwork. Patchwork tends to come from quilting. You see a lot of quilts that are patchwork or even pillows that are patchwork. But you can still use this technique to create a piece of material out of your scraps and make whatever it is you want. So patchworking is a great way to take your scraps and create something else from it. But before we can get started, the first thing you're going to have to think about is what do you want to make from your fabric? And to do that, you need to pull out what fabric are you going to use for your project. So I went and I looked in my scrap box and I found all of this beautiful pink and white fabric. And I also found some bigger pieces of pink that I could use as well for this project. So I have a couple handfuls of fabric that I'm going to use today to demonstrate patchworking for you. Now I'm thinking this will turn into a beautiful pillow, with the front of the pillow being a patchwork and the back using these bigger scraps of fabric. And unfortunately at Sew with Stacy we have our own pillow pattern, which you can find on our website, or you can even go to our YouTube channel and find our full tutorial on how you can make a pillow. And instead of using new fabric, let's use our scrap fabric. The next step is to actually then create the design for your pillow. But before we do any of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these scraps of fabric and I'm going to iron them so that they're nice and smooth and we can see how much fabric we actually have so we can create our beautiful design for our pillow that we're going to make. I'm going to do that now and I'll be right back. The pattern for our pillow asks for one front panel that's 19 inches by 19 inches. That panel we're going to use our patchwork technique to create, so we'll do that in just a minute. It also asks for 2 back panels that are 19 inches by 13 inches. I have these 2 bigger pieces of scrap fabrics that I have found that will look really nice with our patchwork panel for the front. So I'm going to measure and cut these first before we start putting together our patchwork design for the front. To create the front panel of our pillow, we will need to have a 19 inch by 19 inch patchwork piece. Now we won't have one big piece of fabric, we have lots of little pieces. So we need to have a guide to make sure we know how big of a piece of fabric we're making from our patchwork and ensuring that it's big enough to fit our pillow design. You can use a rotary mat like this one on my tabletop right now, which has a lot of guide marks and measurements so you can see how big you're making things. If you don't have one of these, that's absolutely fine. I'll show you a second method that you can use to create those guide marks to ensure that you're creating a patchwork piece that's big enough for our pillow. I'm going to put our rotary mat to the side, and I'm going to grab some masking tape, and I'm going to grab our ruler. And we want to make sure that we have a cleared out space on our worktop that's going to be big enough to have a 19 by 19 inch patchwork piece laid out on top of it. To create our guide, we need to grab a piece of masking tape and put it on our worktop on one side and making sure that it's at least 19 inches long. This will be one side of our pillow guide. From the inside edge of that line, we're going to measure to 19 and put another piece of tape on the other edge of your ruler. So that gives us 2 sides that are 19 apart. Then we're going to take another piece of masking tape and lay it across the top of this space. And again from there, take our ruler and measure down 19 and put our last piece of masking tape at the bottom. If your masking tape keeps breaking, kind of like mine is, you can use smaller pieces to create that line. We have now created a template on our worktop of a 19 by 19 inch panel. Next, all we need to do is start laying across our pieces of fabric to create our beautiful patchwork design. The process for laying out your patchwork design is really up to you. How you want to use your pieces of fabric is one of the most unique things that you can do as a sewer, and gives you free creativity to design whatever it is you want to design. I've got a lot of strips of fabric, lots of long strips of fabric. So I thought for my design, it would be best if I had them either lying straight across or possibly on a diagonal. As I ironed these pieces, I was looking at the sizes and kind of was thinking about how I wanted to lay out this patchwork design. And I thought this one piece of satin fabric would be a nice piece for the middle because it gives it a nice central design. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start laying out some of the other pieces of fabric I have against this one piece of fabric to make my full design for my pillow. I do have my scissors and my fabric pencil here, as well as my ruler, in the case that I might want to cut some of these pieces, maybe because I want to have more of a symmetrical pattern, or maybe I think the colors will work in different ways. So I always have those next to me. I'm going to go ahead and start laying out this design. And as I'm laying it out, when I start putting the pieces, I want to make sure my pieces are overlapping that template that I've put in. So I know that I'm going to have a big enough piece for the front of my pillow. So you can see that this goes from edge to edge, and that's going to give me a nice 19-inch by 19-inch piece of fabric. In turn, as I'm laying other pieces over, when I sew these together, we're going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you want to make sure that you have about a 1/4 of an inch laying over each of the fabrics, so you can kind of get a sense of how big the pieces are going to be together once they're sewn together. I'm going to start laying them out now, and let's see where we go. Laid out my fabric into a design I'm quite happy with. I like having this really dark central specific satiny piece of fabric in the middle. It gives it a little bit of something to stand out. And I like having some of the different textures and the different patterns intermarked with some of the lighter and the darker fabrics. A couple things I noticed. Number one is that this panel here, we're not long enough to go across that whole width, but what we can do is we can sew those together so that we can create one longer piece. It still won't affect the design. It actually might give it a little bit of an enhancement. I'll show you how to do that when we put it together. I also noticed that some of the pieces have what's called a selvage edge, which is the edge of the fabric when you get it off of your bolt. So I wanted to make sure that when I laid that down and I put the next piece of fabric on it, that selvage edge isn't going to be visible. It can be a little bit distracting on your design. So you want to make sure that your pieces, if they have that edge, you're going to cater for that when you actually sew them together. And the third thing is all of our fabric is laid out now so that we have purposely covered that whole 19 by 19 inch template we had put on our table. So now we know when we sew these all together, we're going to have enough of a panel of fabric that we can use for the front of our pillow. Our next step is to sew these pieces together to create that patchwork panel, and I'll show you how to do that now. In preparation to sew our patchwork panel together, I went ahead and put all the pieces on top of one another, starting from one end to the other. That way I know what pieces need to be sewed together. I've also decided just to use some white thread for this because white thread will work really nicely with all these fabrics. To start sewing, what we need to do is we need to take our first piece of fabric and our second piece of fabric and put them right sides together, align them in the middle. That way we can make sure our coverage for our panels, we're going to have a big enough piece of panel. Once we line them up, we're going to sew along that edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We then open it up and you can see that the two pieces are now sewed together. We will then take the second piece of fabric we had, which was this dark pink, and our third piece of fabric, put them right sides facing and line them up in the middle, and then sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that edge as well. Now, with my fourth piece of fabric I need to sew on here, these two pieces need to be sewn together. And to do that, I'm going to create a cross with the two pieces of fabric. Let's move this out of the way. And then I'm going to sew from the one corner to the other corner so that when I turn it around, you'll have a nice diagonal edge, and that piece of fabric will be linear or straight from one another. So I'm going to create that cross, grab my ruler and my marker again. Draw that line and sew straight along that marked line. I'm then going to trim that fabric back. When I turn that out, I will have one nice long continuous piece of fabric. And now I can attach it to the rest of my patchwork, taking that third piece of fabric and this now new fourth piece of fabric, right sides together, align it in the middle, and then stitch them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to keep doing this process until all our pieces are sewn together on our patchwork panel. I've now finished sewing all of my panels together to create my patchwork panel. What I need to do next is press my panel. That way, when we trim this piece to be the 19 by 19 panel that we need for our pillow, all of our seams and all of our fabric will be nice and flat, and we can make sure we have the right size that we need for our pillow. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a nice press now, and I'll be right back. We have finished sewing and pressing our absolutely gorgeous patchwork panel now. We need to measure and mark this panel so that it's 19 by 19 inches, which is what's required for the pattern of our pillow. To do those markings, we want to measure several times to make sure we're happy with those measurements before we make any cuts into this panel. The last thing you want to do is make some cuts into this and then have a mistake and then have to redo it again. It's never fun. So let's start by getting our ruler and our fabric pencil and finding a line that we want to have as one edge of our pillow. If you remember when we laid it out, we had it at this diagonal space with all of these lines on a diagonal. So my first edge will be over here on my left or your right, and I'm going to be as close to the edge as I possibly can without going over. So that way I can make sure that there's fabric on every edge of this panel. And I'm just going to make a long line on this fabric. You'll want to do this when the fabric is facing upwards so you have a good visual of what it will look like when it's on your pillow or whatever other pattern you're using for this piece. Now that I have that line in place, I want to measure 19 from that line to the other edge, just like we did in the beginning when we put our masking tape down for our template. So that's 19, and I'm going to make a mark there. Then I'm going to come down here to 19 again, make a mark, and then I will connect those two lines up and create another big long line down this piece of fabric. So now we have two edges of our pillow, and we now need to create the other two edges. And the best way to do that is to take your ruler and to identify where the 19 is, so you know kind of where you need those two marks to be, and to play around a little bit and see where, if you were in the middle of this pillow, I kind of wanted this to be in the middle of it. So if I line my ruler up, let me move this up a little bit. So that line is approximately in the middle of this pillow. It's not going to be quite in the middle, but this is pretty darn close. But you can see I have a little bit of a restriction because it starts to end right there. So I'm quite happy with the placement of that middle panel will be. So I'm going to use this bottom piece here as my bottom part of my pillow. Once I place that mark, I can then line up my ruler nicely with the other lines. So now I have the bottom edge of my pillow. And then now I need to just find the top. And to find the top, I start on 19 from here. Mark it at the top. And then continue that line. So I can now see an outline of my pillow panel, which goes right there. And I can figure out, am I happy with that? Or do I need to make some adjustments? And see where the corner of this is and the corner of this aren't quite right. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that line up just a smidge. I'm going to move that to about 1 inch up and then move that one 1 inch up. So if I do that, it's pretty easy to make that adjustment. Don't worry about the marks on the actual fabric. They will wash off. Just some water. So I'm going to bring that line up 1 inch and move that line up 1 inch. I think that will make it more even. So you can see that corner there and that corner there. Corner there and there. That makes it a little bit more even. I think I'll go with that. And the final thing I want to do is I just want to make sure all these marks are 19 inches in as many places as possible so that I have a squared piece for my pillow. I now know I need to cut along this and that line there, that line there, this darker line, and this darker line. We're going to go ahead and cut. And there we have our patchwork panel for the front of our pillow. 100% made from scrap fabric. We now have our beautiful patchwork panel measured and cut. And this, along with our 2 back panels and our piping, will go ahead and complete the pillow. Congratulations, you have just finished putting together this beautiful patchwork piece of paneling for our wonderful pillow, made 100% from scrap fabric that more than likely would have gone into waste. The second technique I'm going to show you today is called applique. Applique might be a bit of a funny word, but what it means is being able to take pieces of fabric and then sewing them on top of another piece of fabric. To demonstrate the applique technique, first we need to decide what we're going to make. I have found a heap of multiple colored fabrics, particularly this rainbow fabric, which I think would make something quite cute and fun. And the amount of this that we have, I'm actually thinking of making the drawstring bag that we have here at Sew with Stacy. If you haven't seen it already, you can go to my website, sewwithstacy.com, or have a look at my YouTube channel and find the full tutorial on how you can make your own drawstring bag. I'm going to use the applique process to create the outside of the bag. And then I have some of these fun colors that I could possibly use for the inside. Now, the only thing that you will need in order for this to work will be a piece of interfacing. Interfacing is a piece of fabric that we can sew things on and provide some stability for the pattern that you're going to use. And in this case, because we're not going to be applying this to a bigger piece of fabric, using interfacing will be really important to make sure we can keep the shape that we need to create our drawstring bag, but to have the really fun applique look that we're going for. So in our case, we'll be using the interfacing to create the shape of the pattern we need for the outside of our bag, and then use the other fabrics for the inside as we would with a normal bag. But before we get started, I need to take all of these scraps of fabric and iron them so I know what I've got, and we can do our applique process as easy as possible. I'm going to go do that now and I'll be right back. The pattern for our drawstring bag asks for 2 11 by 13 panels for the outside of the bag. And that's the part of the bag that we're going to use our applique to create the beautiful design. We'll do that shortly. It also asks for 2 pieces of fabric that are 11 by 13 for the inside of the bag. And I found this really pretty red fabric from my stash of fabric scraps that's big enough for me to use for the inside of our drawstring bag. So I'm going to cut out our inside pieces first, and then we'll go ahead and do our applique design next. Before we do any of our applique, we will need to cut our interfacing to the size that we're going to need to create our drawstring bag. So I'm going to measure and cut 2 pieces of interfacing to that size. We are now ready to create our mosaic on top of our interfacing. You want to make sure that the fusible side of your interfacing is facing up. So when we put our pieces of fabric on top of it, we'll be placing them so the wrong side is down. And once it's all in, we'll iron it and it will stick to that interfacing. Check your interfacing directions to make sure you have that sticky side facing up on your worktop. For my interfacing, you can see a little bit of a sheen. That's the little bit of glue that is on top of that piece of material that will adhere the fabric to it once we do iron. So I want that facing up, and then we just start placing our pieces of fabric however we want to have them appear on the design that we're looking for our drawstring bag. And that's just a lot of fiddling around and figuring out where we think the fabric might look. Don't worry about overlapping. It will be absolutely fine, because once we do this and once we iron it, we are going to also do some stitching across the top to make sure it sticks and it gives it a good, fun look on our drawstring bag. I'm going to go ahead and just continue placing pieces of fabric that I have here. You can also cut pieces if you want, if you like a different look or a different design, whatever you want. It is your call. Completed putting all of our little pieces of fabric on the interfacing that will create the outside part of our drawstring bag. Per the instructions of our interfacing, I now need to take this and iron with a hot iron so that these pieces of fabric will stick to the interfacing, and then we can complete our applique process. Make sure to check the directions on your interfacing to ensure that you're using it properly so that you can get your fabric to stick onto your interfacing. I'm going to go take this, iron it, and I'll be back in just a minute. Once you've completed ironing all of your fabrics onto your interfacing, you'll want to trim off any extra pieces that have gone over the interfacing template. So you just turn it over and just trim off any of the extra fabric, ensuring you're not cutting the actual interfacing itself. Our final step with our applique will be to go across all of these lines that we've put with all our fabrics with a zigzag stitch to not only secure the fabric onto the interfacing, but also to give it a really fun design. If you've never used the zigzag stitch on your machine, I recommend you go to your machine manual and figure out how you can actually set your zigzag stitch. Every machine is different, so it's important that you use your machine manual to ensure that you're using your zigzag stitch correctly. I recommend using a middle width zigzag stitch. Typically you'll have different widths of how wide the thread is when you do your zigzag stitch. Choose one that's kind of in the middle. And if you've never used your machine before for zigzagging, I recommend that you do some trial runs on an extra piece of fabric like I've done here. And once you feel comfortable, what you'll want to do is you'll want to grab one of your panels, start from the bottom, and just start following the lines around, lining them with a zigzag stitch. On this bottom panel here, I just followed along the outline of that little rectangle with a zigzag stitch. It secures the fabric to the interfacing and it creates a really cute design. I'm going to continue doing this for all of the fabric on both panels until we have all the zigzags completed. Once you finish the zigzags on your applique, we're now done completing our fabric panels for our drawstring bag. So these two panels will make up the front of the bag. We also have our two scraps of fabric that we found that will be for the inside of our bag. And then I also found these great ribbon that we can use for the drawstring from our scraps as well. I'm going to go ahead and just construct our bag, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Congratulations! You have just learned how to make a piece of fabric using this beautiful applique process, and we created an absolutely gorgeous drawstring bag. 100% made from scrap fabric that would have likely gone into the trash. Thank you so much for joining us at Sew with Stacy today. All the information about this project, including links to the patterns that we used, can be found in the description below and on our website, sewwithstacy.com. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel to find all the wonderful sewing tutorials that we already have, plus any new ones we have coming up in the future. We have a whole host of easy DIY sewing tutorials that are coming your way, specifically designed for beginning sewers to help you learn this incredible craft of sewing. We really appreciate you joining us today and look forward to seeing you very soon.